I wanted to give my daughter an old house, but she shouted, "Why do I need this rotten shack? My mother-in-law gave me a car." She refused. 3 days later, I sold the plot for $850,000. When she found out the amount, my daughter abandoned the car and ran to me with a cake. But when I told her who I had sent the money to, she had a hysterical breakdown right there on the street. Greetings, dear listeners. Before I begin telling this complicated story of my life, I ask you to support our channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. This is very important for us. And now, enjoy listening. I had spent 72 years of my life working hard, saving every penny I could, and quietly dreaming of the day I could give my daughter something that mattered, not just a fleeting gift, not a token that could be forgotten or misplaced, but something that carried the weight of history, something tangible that she could step into and make her own. I had dreamed of this moment for decades, imagining her walking through a space filled with memory and potential, feeling the invisible threads of our family's story wrap around her like a comforting embrace. When I inherited the old house in the countryside, my heart had leaped in a way I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just a house. It was a vessel of our past. Its floors had creaked under the footsteps of ancestors long gone, the walls had held laughter and tears alike, and the scent of the old wood carried echoes of celebrations, quiet mornings, and the small, precious routines of those who had come before me. I remembered every detail from my own childhood visits. The way sunlight slanted across the wooden beams in the late afternoon, the smell of the garden after rain, the soft rustle of leaves outside the windows. That house had been more than shelter. It had been a companion to generations, a repository of life lived fully, and now I imagined it as a gift to Rachel, a bridge between our past and her future. I thought of her as I wrapped the keys in a soft cloth, cradling them as if they contained not just metal, but a piece of my heart. My hand shook slightly, both from excitement and from a quiet, nervous hope that this gesture would reach her in the way I imagined. I rehearsed what I would say on the walk to her front door, the words forming and reforming in my mind. "Rachel, I want you to have something special. A home that belongs to you and to our family." The simplicity of the words belied the depth of feeling behind them, the years of labor and love and quiet endurance that had built up to this single act. When I arrived at her house, the sun was beginning its descent, spilling a golden light over the quiet street. My heart pounded as I approached the door, the wrapped keys clutched in my hand. I could almost feel the pulse of expectation in my chest, a rhythm that matched the quickening of my steps. I knocked gently, and when Rachel opened the door, I was greeted not just by her face, but by a rush of all the memories, hopes, and anxieties that had led me to this moment. "Rachel," I said, holding the bundle out to her, my voice trembling just slightly, betraying the magnitude of what I felt. "I want you to have something special. A home that belongs to you and to our family." I tried to keep my tone steady, but inside, I was a whirlwind of emotion, anticipation, hope, love, and a quiet fear that the gift might not be received as I had envisioned. I pictured her eyes lighting up, the corners crinkling in gratitude, the warmth of understanding flowing between us. I imagined her stepping across the threshold of a house filled with history, brushing her hands along the worn banister, running her fingers over the textured walls, and knowing that she was stepping into a legacy built just for her. I lingered in that moment, absorbing every detail, the gentle hum of the neighborhood, the faint scent of her kitchen drifting into the hallway, the way the light caught the strands of her hair. Everything seemed to pause, as if the world itself was holding its breath for her reaction. I knew that this was more than a gift. It was a hope made concrete, a piece of my life extended to hers. And for a fleeting heartbeat, I truly believed, that this would be the moment when our hearts connected through a shared understanding of love, legacy, and family. I smiled softly, a tremor of both joy and nerves tugging at me, waiting for her to open the cloth, for her fingers to touch the keys that carried decades of memory, for her to see not just a house, but the heart of a mother who had longed to give something meaningful. In that instant, I felt both vulnerable and powerful, standing at the threshold of possibility, hoping that my gift would become more than a material thing. It would be a bridge between generations, a testament to love, and a beginning of something beautiful for my daughter. Her reaction hit me like a thunderclap, sharp and unrelenting. I had imagined anticipation, surprise, maybe even tears of gratitude, but not this. Not the way she snatched the keys from my hand as if I were trying to chain her to some burden she didn't want. Her fingers clutched the cold metal and flung it across the table, and for a moment I could only stare, my mouth dry, my chest tightening as though someone had pressed a hand against my ribs. "Why do I need this rotten shack?" she shouted, her voice tearing through the quiet of the room. Each word echoed like a hammer striking stone, reverberating in a way that left my stomach hollow and my heart bruised. And then, as if to sharpen the sting further, she added, "My mother-in-law gave me a car." A car. Not a word of thanks, not an acknowledgement of the years I had poured into saving, into planning, into imagining this day, just a flippant comparison, as though the house I had cherished and inherited meant nothing beside a flashy, convenient gift from someone else. I felt my vision blur with a mix of hurt and anger, a tight, bitter coil wrapping around my chest. It wasn't just disappointment, it was a profound sense of betrayal. I had spent my life thinking I could teach her the value of things that endure, of legacy, of the richness found not in fleeting convenience, but in stories, in history, in tangible love. And now, in a single breath, all of that labor, all of that quiet hope, seemed dismissed with cruel simplicity. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the woman I loved, my daughter, my flesh and blood, with the one who stood before me, spitting scorn at something I had given with every ounce of my heart. I could feel the heat rising in my face, a flush of indignation mingled with sadness. Each syllable she spoke drove invisible spikes deeper into my chest. I wanted to speak, to explain, to make her understand that this house was more than wood and nails, that it was the embodiment of decades of care, of generations who had lived and loved within its walls. I wanted to tell her about the creaking floors where her grandparents had danced, about the mornings when the sun would strike the kitchen windows just so, painting the room golden, about the garden that had been coaxed to bloom through the hands of those who had come before us. But the words felt absurd in the face of her fury, inadequate to bridge the chasm that had opened between us in that instant. I left that day feeling hollow, as though a part of me had been stripped away. My steps were slow, almost mechanical, as I walked through the rooms that had once seemed alive with potential. My fingers brushed over the chipped paint on the windows, tracing the grooves worn into the wooden floors by decades of footsteps, and I imagined laughter that would never echo here again, dinners that would never fill these walls with warmth, conversations that would never bounce from room to room. The house was unchanged, still rich with history and quiet beauty, but my heart ached at the emptiness Rachel had left in its intended future. Every corner, every shadow, seemed to mock me, reminding me not of what could be, but of what had been denied. I could feel tears threatening, not only for the house but for the daughter who could not, or would not, see its value. I had wanted to offer her continuity, a chance to carry on something lasting, something beyond the transient allure of convenience, but she had refused. The refusal cut deeper than words ever could, and in that pain, a strange awareness began to bloom. Love, however profound, cannot force understanding, and gifts, even those meant with the purest intentions, can be rejected without malice, but with consequence. As I sat in the quiet rooms, letting the echo of her words settle, I realized that the hurt was not just for the house, but for the chasm in our connection. I had envisioned joy, gratitude, and a bridge between generations, and instead, I faced disbelief and disappointment. The walls, the floors, the air that held decades of memories, all seemed to whisper back at me, reminding me that some things are precious only to those who are willing to see them, and some lessons must be learned the hard way. And yet, despite the ache, a small ember of resolve stirred within me, a quiet insistence that this house and my intentions still had worth, even if she could not see it yet. For 3 days, I could not escape her words. They played in my mind like a relentless recording, each repetition gnawing at my chest until I felt raw inside. Why do I need this rotten shack? Her voice was sharp, bitter, dismissive, and it clung to my memory as though it had rooted itself there permanently. I could hear it when I woke, when I walked, even in the quiet moments when I thought I might find solace. Every syllable seemed to echo off the walls of the house, bouncing from room to room, mocking the care and hope I had invested in it. I wandered through the empty spaces, tracing the worn grooves in the wooden floors, touching the peeling paint along the windowsills, as if the house itself could offer comfort. But the silence that met me was heavier than any words could have been. I imagined, against the cruel clarity of reality, what life could have been. I pictured children running through the rooms, their laughter ricocheting off the walls, their footsteps blending with the echoes of the past. I imagined family dinners at the old, worn wooden table, plates clattering, voices rising and falling in joy, stories told and retold across generations. Winter nights came to mind, the fireplace crackling, its warmth spreading through the house, bringing together bodies and hearts. But these images were just that, images unattainable and fleeting. I could feel their absence pressing in on me, making the walls seem narrower, the rooms colder, the floors harder underfoot. The house had once symbolized continuity, hope, and love, but now it felt like a monument to my failure, a testament to what I had imagined but could not realize. I questioned myself constantly. Had I misjudged her? Misunderstood her desires? I thought I knew Rachel, knew what would bring her joy, what would carry meaning in her life. And yet, she had rejected it, thrown my efforts aside as though they were nothing. It was not the house itself that hurt. It was the rejection of me, of my intentions, of the lifetime of thought and care I had poured into choosing something she could treasure. I felt the sting of it more sharply than I had expected, as though the weight of her words pressed directly against my chest, squeezing until I struggled to breathe. Frustration mingled with grief. I loved her, of course I did, with a fierce maternal intensity that had never wavered. But love, I realized with a heavy heart, cannot compel appreciation. It cannot make someone see what you see, nor can it force gratitude where there is none. I had believed that the house, steeped in history and memory, would speak for itself, that it would reveal its value without my having to insist. Yet her dismissal proved otherwise. The house, once vibrant with imagined possibilities, seemed now to mock me with its emptiness. Each room, each dusty corner, each faint smell of old wood and memories seemed to whisper, "You are alone in this." She did not understand. I found myself lingering in the kitchen, running my fingers over the scarred surface of the old counter, imagining the meals I had hoped she would cook, the conversations that would have unfolded there. I touched the staircase rail, polished smooth by decades of use, imagining her children climbing it, imagining me telling stories on the landing as they went up and down. But the reality was stillness, a stillness so profound it became almost unbearable. I wandered from room to room, my steps echoing, and sometimes I would pause to press my palm against the walls, hoping for some invisible pulse of life, some warmth that might tell me this house could still carry love. And yet, grief and frustration blended into something sharper, something I could not quite name. It was disappointment at the gap between my intentions and her perception, a sorrow that this simple gift, so carefully chosen, had been met with contempt rather than understanding. I had wanted to give her not just a house, but a piece of our family, a tangible link to our past, a foundation for her future. Instead, I was left to confront a void, to feel the silence of the rooms as a rebuke, a reminder that sometimes love alone is not enough to bridge the divide between generations. By the third day, I realized that the pain was not going to fade on its own. The grief had roots, entwined with memories, with hope, with longing. And though my heart ached, there was also a flicker of something else, a quiet, simmering awareness that perhaps the value of the house and of my effort was not diminished simply because she could not see it. The house was still there, solid, enduring, and despite the emptiness and the rejection, it retained the potential I had once imagined. And for the first time in those 3 days, I began to consider that perhaps this house and this hurt might yet have a purpose beyond my sorrow. That late afternoon, I wandered through the house again, my footsteps slower, more deliberate than before. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the windows and catching the dust motes that floated lazily in the warm golden light. For the first time since Rachel had rejected my gift, I stopped noticing the flaws, the peeling paint, the warped floorboards, the ceiling that had begun to sag in one corner. They were still there, of course, reminders of age and wear, but something inside me shifted, and suddenly they felt less like imperfections and more like stories, evidence of endurance, of history, of life lived long and hard within these walls. I ran my hand along the old banister, feeling the smoothness where generations of hands had passed, and I felt a flicker of pride. These beams, these foundations, they had supported my family for decades. They had weathered storms, celebrated triumphs, and held laughter and tears alike. The house was strong. It was solid. It had survived. And as I walked through the rooms, something remarkable happened. I began to see the potential I had overlooked in my grief, the beauty that had been there all along but had been buried beneath my hurt. The kitchen, once just a room, now felt like a space that could be loved again. The sunlight streaming through the cracked windows highlighted the gentle curves of the warm cabinetry, the shelves that had held generations of dishes and memories. I imagined it anew, not as a decrepit space, but as a place where a family could gather, where someone could make it their own, where life could blossom once more. The dining room, with its uneven floors and faded wallpaper, whispered stories of dinners and celebrations, of hands reaching across the table to share bread, wine, laughter. And the living room, with its crooked fireplace and slightly warped mantel, held the promise of warmth in winter nights, of quiet evenings spent with a book or music playing softly. I climbed the narrow staircase, each step creaking under my weight, and I realized that these very creaks, these minor imperfections, gave the house character. They told a story that could not be replicated, a narrative of endurance and resilience that was rare in today's cookie-cutter homes. I could see now that the house was not simply old. It was authentic. It had substance, history, and soul, a quality that could not be bought, that could not be manufactured. And while Rachel had called it a rotten shack, I understood in that moment that its value was not diminished by her perception. Value was not determined by one person's taste. It was intrinsic, waiting for the right eyes to recognize it. I stepped outside, onto the expansive plot of land, and the breadth of it hit me. The overgrown grass, the leaning fences, the trees that had grown wild, they were all part of the property's charm. I could imagine gardens blooming, children running through the open spaces, sunlight filtering through the leaves in late afternoon, much as it did now. The potential was immense. The house was no longer a symbol of rejection. It was a tool, a resource, a vessel of possibility. That evening, I sat at my old kitchen table, pen in hand, making a list, not of problems, but of opportunities. The more I thought, the more I realized that I had a chance to turn the tide. Rejection did not have to be the end. It could be the beginning. The idea of selling the property, of transforming what had once been a source of pain into a path forward, began to thrill me. I imagined someone else discovering the beauty I had come to see, someone who would pay handsomely for it, someone who would value the history, the strength, the character of this house. By the time twilight settled over the countryside, a quiet determination had taken root in me. I picked up the phone and called a local real estate agent I had heard about through a friend, explaining the property's features, its history, and without mentioning Rachel's rejection, asking for an appraisal. My voice, steady and calm, carried a confidence I had not felt in days. As I hung up, I realized that for the first time since she had refused the house, I felt free, not bitter, not hurt, not trapped in sorrow. Instead, I felt a surge of empowerment. I had shifted the narrative. I had taken something that had wounded me and reframed it as an opportunity. For the first time in 3 days, I smiled, small and quiet, but real. The house was no longer a monument to disappointment. It was a canvas, waiting for someone to see what I had finally come to see. And perhaps, in time, I would find the satisfaction of knowing that its worth, like my own, was not defined by someone else's inability to appreciate it. I went to bed that night with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The house, once a symbol of pain, had become a beacon of possibility. I closed my eyes, imagining what might come, and for the first time in a long while, I felt hope. Not the fragile, desperate hope of a gift rejected, but the steady, empowering hope of a plan set in motion. The house had a future, and I intended to make sure it, and I would be seen and valued. When Karen, the real estate agent, stepped into the house, I could see her eyes widen almost immediately. She paused mid-step in the foyer, her gaze sweeping over the walls, the floors, the windows, lingering on details I had almost taken for granted. I watched her as if through a mirror, curious to see whether she would recognize the value I had only just begun to appreciate myself. "Olivia," she said, her voice catching slightly, "this is a rare find. With some marketing, you could easily sell it for hundreds of thousands." I froze for a moment, the words echoing in my mind. Hundreds of thousands. My breath hitched. The house Rachel had so carelessly dismissed, the house that had made me ache with disappointment and self-doubt for days, was worth a fortune. My heart pounded, not with excitement alone, but with a fierce, intoxicating rush of empowerment. Years of toil, of careful saving, of loving this property with all its flaws and quirks, had culminated in a truth I had never expected. The value I saw was real, tangible, and recognized by someone else. I followed Karen through the rooms, my eyes tracing the patterns of light on the floors, the shadows of the afternoon sun through the cracked windows, the elegant lines of the old beams that had held this house together for decades. I noticed details I had overlooked in my grief, the subtle craftsmanship in the molding, the solid weight of the doors, the way the fireplaces still hinted at warmth even in their quiet emptiness. Each element that Rachel had mocked, each worn surface I had mourned, was part of the house's story, part of what made it rare, desirable, and valuable. Karen continued, her tone shifting from admiration to excitement. She talked about potential buyers, about marketing strategies, about the interest a home like this could generate. I listened, nodding, but inside I felt a transformation occurring. This was no longer merely about the house. This was about me. Rachel's disdain, her cruel dismissal, had not diminished me, nor had it diminished the worth of what I cherished. In fact, it had inadvertently clarified it. She had underestimated not only the house but me. That realization warmed me more than the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. I began imagining what could be done with this newfound power. I could sell the house, of course, and the thought of the money that could come from it thrilled me, not for my own indulgence, but for the possibilities it could open. I could help others, I could contribute to causes I cared about, I could transform pain into purpose. The house, once a source of heartache, had become my instrument of strength. The thought alone made me smile, quietly, almost incredulously, as if I were discovering a secret I had carried unknowingly for decades. Karen led me upstairs, pointing out the bedrooms and potential uses for each, and I felt a strange surge of pride. The rooms seemed to resonate with possibility now, no longer hollow or empty. I imagined them staged for sale. Furniture placed carefully, sunlight highlighting the warmth of the wood, the charm of a space that had endured through generations. And I realized that the rejection I had felt, Rachel's sharp words, the sense of being unappreciated, had been transformed into fuel. It had sharpened my perception, clarified my priorities, and reminded me that my value was not dependent on someone else's approval. As we moved back to the living room, Karen's enthusiasm continued, but I began to focus inward. I thought of the irony. How a gift I had offered with love, once so scorned by the intended recipient, had revealed a power I did not even know I possessed. I could act, I could decide, I could reclaim control over a situation that had left me feeling small and rejected. For the first time in days, I felt clarity, focus, and a quiet triumph building inside me, like the slow gathering of sunlight before dawn. I lingered by the large window that faced the garden, running my fingers along the worn sill. The house had stood here through storms, through seasons of plenty and scarcity alike. And now, in my 72nd year, it had offered me a lesson I had not anticipated. Resilience and value are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for recognition, waiting for courage to act. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the scent of old wood and earth, and felt a sense of readiness I had not known in years. Rachel's rejection, the source of my heartbreak, had become irrelevant. What mattered now was possibility, action, and purpose. The house, my house, was not just a piece of property. It was a testament to patience, endurance, and perspective. And I, Olivia, was finally beginning to understand how much power I truly held, how much control I had to turn disappointment into triumph, grief into purpose, and a rotten shack into a tool of transformation. For the first time in a long while, I felt fully in command of my life, of my choices, and of the future that awaited. And in that moment, walking through the rooms with Karen at my side, I realized that the real revelation was not the house's value. It was mine. 3 days had passed since I had listed the house, and every tick of the clock had been measured in anticipation. I had allowed myself a quiet confidence, the kind that comes not from arrogance, but from a deep, measured understanding of one's own worth and the value of the choices made. When the call finally came, confirming the sale for $850,000, I felt a rush of relief, pride, and something more subtle, a sense of poetic justice that was both satisfying and strangely tender. The house that had caused me so much pain, the house Rachel had so heartlessly dismissed, had found a buyer who recognized its worth, and through that recognition, I recognized my own power to act and shape outcomes. I waited, letting the news settle in my chest before I allowed myself to think about Rachel. My mind replayed her words, her scorn, her refusal. And now there was a kind of symmetry to the situation that made the sting of her rejection recede and transform into clarity. The house was gone, the money was gone, and the lesson, if she could only see it, was firmly in place. I had turned grief into action, and action into tangible consequence, a chain of events she had no control over. When Rachel arrived, I was in the garden, tending to the small roses I had planted by the old stone wall. Her arrival was frantic, almost theatrical. She abandoned the shiny new car her mother-in-law had given her, leaving it in the driveway as if it had suddenly lost all value, and ran toward me with a cake clutched in her hands. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, a mixture of desperation and sudden guilt playing across her features. "Mom," she cried, her voice pleading, nearly trembling with urgency. She tried to close the distance between us, as if proximity alone could erase the disdain she had shown just days before. I looked at her calmly, letting my composure anchor the moment. I had been tested, and I had chosen clarity over emotion, strategy over impulse. "Rachel," I said, my voice even and steady, carrying the weight of certainty, "the money is already gone." Her expression faltered, confusion and panic mingling across her features. "Gone? Where?" she stammered, her voice small now, almost fragile. I let the silence stretch, letting the gravity of the situation settle between us like a tangible presence. In that pause, I saw her mind working, circling the truth, realizing that her earlier arrogance had left her powerless. I took a deliberate breath and spoke again, my tone unwavering, measured with care. "I sent it to a charity that helps elderly women struggling to keep their homes." For a moment, she froze entirely, her body rigid, her arms stiff as the cake began to slip. I could see the comprehension hit her in waves, the collision of guilt, regret, and shock painting her features in stark relief. The cake, a sweet offering meant to bridge the divide, tumbled from her hands and splattered across the sidewalk, a sticky, colorful mess that mirrored the emotional chaos she now faced. And then it happened. The restraint she had maintained, the polite composure she had managed in the face of my prior calm, evaporated. She screamed, a raw, almost animal sound, and began to cry uncontrollably. Her body shook with the force of her realization, her knees buckling as she collapsed onto the pavement. It was not merely the loss of money or the house. It was the cumulative recognition of everything she had undervalued. The opportunity, the generosity, the wisdom in my years, and the lesson she had so stubbornly ignored. I watched her, my heart heavy but clear. There was no joy in her suffering, No satisfaction in punishment, only the inevitable consequences of choices made in ignorance and haste. And yet, I felt a sense of quiet triumph, not over Rachel, but over circumstance. I had been wronged by rejection, yes, but I had acted with intelligence and grace. I had transformed a moment of hurt into a meaningful outcome, a ripple effect that reached beyond personal vindication. The charity would benefit women in need, the house had found a new purpose, and I had reclaimed agency over a situation that once threatened to leave me powerless. I knelt beside her, careful not to touch the cake-smeared pavement, and whispered softly, "It's too late to change what you missed, Rachel. But perhaps it's not too late to understand why it mattered." Her sobs continued, ragged and unrelenting, yet I sensed in that chaos a spark of comprehension, however painful. It was the first step, the beginning of a reckoning that she could not avoid. As I stood back, watching her tremble and wail under the harsh afternoon sun, I felt a profound sense of closure. This triumph was mine, earned through patience, reflection, and decisive action. And in that triumph, I found peace. I had acted with integrity, wisdom, and foresight, and the results, though dramatic, were simply a reflection of reality. The lesson had been delivered, and though it arrived in turmoil, it was a truth Rachel would carry with her forever, whether she liked it or not. I stood there, just beyond the splattered cake, watching Rachel collapse in the street, her body shaking, her face streaked with tears and flushed with raw frustration. The air around us felt electric, thick with the aftermath of revelation, regret, and unfiltered emotion. And yet, despite the chaos before me, I felt an unexpected calm settle deep into my bones. It was a quiet triumph, subtle but undeniable, one that had nothing to do with her anguish and everything to do with the journey I had undertaken over the past week. For years I had measured myself by her approval, by the warmth in her eyes, by the gratitude I hoped she would show for the sacrifices I had made. I had thought love was reciprocated in recognition and excitement, that the joy I poured into every small gesture would naturally return to me tenfold. But the harsh reality had been different. Her rejection of the house, her scornful dismissal of something I held dear, had pierced me with a pain I could scarcely articulate. And yet, in that moment, as I observed her unraveling under the weight of her own realization, I understood that my worth had never been dependent on her response. My value had been there all along, quietly resilient, built from decades of experience, care, and steadfast decision-making. The events of the past days had reshaped my understanding of power and agency. I had taken the sting of rejection and allowed it to guide me rather than define me. I had seen the house not as a symbol of failure, but as an asset, a tangible manifestation of possibility. Through careful reflection and decisive action, I had transformed anger into strategy, hurt into clarity, and despair into purpose. The act of selling the property and directing the proceeds toward women in need had been more than a financial maneuver. It had been a reclamation of my autonomy, a declaration that I could shape outcomes even when circumstances seemed unfavorable. I thought of the house itself, the creaking floors, the thick beams that had withstood decades of storms, the walls that had absorbed laughter and tears from generations past. It had been a vessel of memory, a repository of family history. I had once believed its true value lay in the joy it could bring to Rachel, in the continuation of our shared legacy. But now I saw it differently. Its worth was intrinsic, independent of approval or appreciation. In recognizing this, I realized something profound about myself. My actions, my intentions, and my choices carried weight far beyond the immediate responses of others. I had given a gift that mattered, even if the recipient had failed to see it. And when I redirected its fruits to help those truly in need, I had extended that giving in a form that transcended personal disappointment. Watching Rachel, I felt no cruelty, no triumph over her suffering. My satisfaction was quiet, grounded, a deep sense of alignment between action and principle. I understood that her tears were the natural consequences of pride, impatience, and misunderstanding. Her hysteria, while dramatic, was simply a mirror of the lesson she had so stubbornly ignored. And in seeing that reflection, I understood that life's lessons are often most vividly learned through experience, even when it comes with discomfort or regret. As I breathed in the late afternoon air, I felt a release, a softening of tension that had gripped me since her initial rejection. The anger that had burned in my chest had been transmuted into purpose. The hurt that had hollowed me out had been reshaped into insight. I could see clearly now that my power had never resided in her acceptance, nor in the material gifts I offered, but in the deliberate choices I made, the integrity with which I acted, and the resilience with which I faced challenges. I had given, not just tangible assets, but lessons, experiences, and opportunities for reflection. In doing so, I reclaimed a portion of myself that I had feared lost, a sense of self rooted not in approval, but in principle. And as I looked down at her trembling figure, I recognized a quiet truth. She had learned, even if painfully, even if belatedly. The sting of consequence had finally pierced her complacency, and in that rupture, understanding had begun to take root. I felt a profound compassion for her confusion and grief, tempered by an unshakable awareness of my own growth. For the first time in years, I felt entirely at peace. The turmoil, the hurt, the rejection, they had served their purpose, shaping me into someone more measured, more resilient, more certain of her own worth. I realized, fully and unreservedly, that my triumph had been mine all along, not in the reaction of my daughter, but within myself. My heart, my mind, and my spirit had been restored, not through vindication, but through reflection, wisdom, and the courage to act according to what I knew to be right. And in that still, quiet victory, I understood something essential. True strength is not measured by the approval we receive, but by the integrity with which we live and the clarity with which we navigate life's trials.